Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're diving into the story of one of the most famous warriors in Japanese history, Miyamoto Musashi. But before we even get into swinging swords and duels that shook whole cities, I want you to get comfortable. Dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket, or let a fan hum softly in the background. This isn't just history, it's a journey, and I'm going to tell it like you're sitting by a fire, letting the story pull you in. Musashi wasn't just some swordsman, he was the kind of person who left a mark on the world that still echoes today. And tonight, we're going all the way back to where it began, at a time when Japan itself was chaos wrapped in armor. Picture this. It's the year 1584. If you were born in Japan at this moment, your first breath would have been taken in a world where nothing was stable, nothing was certain. Historians call it the Sengoku period, the Warring States era. But let's be honest, that's the polite version. What it really was 100 years of neighbors stabbing each other in the back, warlords clawing at every scrap of land, and armies marching over villages like a storm that never ended. Castles rose and fell, alliances were made over tea and broken by nightfall. The emperor was still there, a respected figurehead, but he had no real power. The shogun had lost control long ago, and Japan was a giant chessboard where every daimyo, the local warlords, were moving pieces and knocking each other off the board as fast as they could. Now imagine being born into that. No peace, no certainty, no grow up and find a steady job kind of life. Your odds were simple: survive or don't. Musashi's first cries echoed in the little village of Miyamoto, tucked away in Harima province. Not a grand city, not a shining capital, just a small, rough patch of earth where the air smelled of wood smoke and hard work. His family wasn't rich. No silk cradles, no soft pillows. Think scratchy cloth and wooden spoons. That was Musashi's welcome to the world. It wasn't comfortable, but maybe that's what shaped him from the start. And then there was his father, Shimon Munisai. Now, this wasn't some regular dad who taught his son to fish or carve toys. Munisai was a professional swordsman. Not professional, like a hobby, but the kind of man who was summoned to duel masters in front of the shogun. He wasn't just good. He was legendary, carrying the title. Unreveled under the sun. Imagine that shadow hanging over you as a kid. Your dad has already beaten some of the greatest swordsmen of his day, and now here you are, just trying to figure out how to walk without face planting in the dirt. Munisai didn't really do hugs or bedtime stories. His idea of father-son bonding was more like handing little Musashi a wooden sword and saying, "Don't cry when you fall." Praise was rare, smiles rarer, and gentle words. Forget it. He wasn't raising a boy, he was forging a weapon, and in a time when softness could mean death. Maybe that was the only way he knew how to prepare his son. From the very beginning, Musashi wasn't like the other kids. While they were learning to bow properly or write neat characters, Musashi was out in the mud, wild and scrappy. Legends even say he had eczema as a child, which meant he hated bathing. Something that later became part of his rough and intimidating persona. Picture a kid with dirt on his face, a messy top knot, and a stare that was already too sharp for his age. That was young Musashi. Not the type to sit still. Not the type to play tag politely. More likely, he was the kid hiding behind a tree, ambushing his friends, and declaring himself the winner of a game they didn't even know they were playing. Home life wasn't about lullabies or sweet lessons. Musashi's playground was hard-packed dirt, the clang of steel in the distance, and the rough voices of men preparing for the next fight. Bedtime stories weren't fairy tales, they were tales of samurai splitting foes in half. And in that world, hesitation meant death. Munisai drilled that into him from the start. If Musashi lost a sparring match, he didn't get a pat on the back. He got bruises and a lecture about survival. But here's the thing, Musashi thrived on it. Where another child might have broken under that kind of pressure, Musashi grew sharper, stronger, more focused. He didn't see the sword as just wood or steel. He saw it as part of himself, an extension of his heartbeat. Every swing was another step toward becoming more than just a boy. The villagers began to notice. They whispered about him. That boy doesn't cry when he bleeds. Some pitied him. Others respected him. But all agreed this wasn't an ordinary child. Something fierce was taking shape. By the time Musashi was barely a teenager, you could already see it. He wasn't just surviving in a brutal world. He was becoming something dangerous. While others dreamed of growing up to serve a lord or earn a small bit of land, Musashi was already dreaming of battles, of reading an opponent before the fight even began. He wasn't pampered. He wasn't coddled. He was being honed, day after day, like a blade against a whet stone. And he was starting to understand a truth most grown men still hadn't learned: battles aren't always won by strength. They're won by the mind, by being faster, smarter, and just a little meaner than the one standing across from you. It's strange to think about, isn't it? This boy, still young enough that most of us today would say he's just a kid, was already living in a way most of us couldn't even imagine. His father's reputation was a weight, his village a hard place to grow, and the whole country was in flames, warlords clawing for power. Out of that, Musashi grew like a wild plant cracking through stone. Not polished, not refined, but tough, resilient, dangerous, and that's where his story truly begins. Before the duels, before the fame, before the name Musashi made warriors shake in their sandals, there was just this scrappy boy, forged by hardship, sharpened by his father's cold hand, and already walking a path that would take him far away from that little village. A path that would lead him into battles, into legend, and eventually into history books centuries later. So, settle in, because this is only the beginning. Musashi's childhood was just the whetstone. The blade hadn't even been drawn yet, and when it finally was, the world would never forget. From the moment Musashi could stand steady on his own 2 feet, the world around him was already sharpening him. Childhood wasn't something he really got to have in the way we think of it. There were no quiet days chasing dragonflies in the fields, no lazy afternoons listening to stories by a warm fire. Instead, his life was smoke, steel, and dirt. His village wasn't just some sleepy place hidden away from danger. Even tucked in the hills, you could always feel the tremors of the larger battles rippling through. Strangers with swords would march past. Farmers would talk in hushed voices about which lord had lost his head this week. The smell of blood in the air wasn't unusual, and inside his own home, the atmosphere was just as hard. Musashi, his father, never let Musashi forget who he was supposed to become. If you were his son, you weren't going to grow into a quiet farmer. You weren't going to be some craftsman smoothing wood into sandals. You were going to carry steel, and you were going to use it. Every single day, young Musashi was given practice. Not soft encouragement, not "take your time, son." No, blunt orders, harsh corrections, and a constant reminder that hesitation was the same as death. Imagine being 6 or 7 years old and your playtime meant swinging a wooden sword heavier than your own skinny arms wanted to carry. Most kids would drop it and cry. But not Musashi. He kept swinging, even when it left bruises on his hands, even when his shoulders screamed with pain. He learned early that pain wasn't something to run from. It was something you just lived with, like hunger or cold. Pain became normal. The villagers noticed. They'd whisper about that boy from Miyamoto. He was different. While their sons were memorizing lessons from priests or learning how to help with planting, Musashi was outside, sweaty, covered in dirt, practicing with a sword like his life depended on it. And maybe in a way, it did. This wasn't just discipline. It was survival training in a world that didn't forgive weakness. But it wasn't just the drills. Musashi's personality was already wild, already untamed. He was scrappy, not the kind of boy to stand in a neat line and wait for someone to tell him what to do. If the other kids played tag, Musashi wasn't running just to be caught. He was planning ambushes, popping out from behind trees, tackling his friends before they even knew the game had started. He wasn't learning the rules of play. He was learning how to break them, how to bend them until they gave him the advantage. That spark of cunning, that instinct to win on his own terms, was already there long before he ever picked up real steel. And yet, underneath that roughness, there was pressure building. His father's shadow loomed large. Musashi wasn't just a good swordsman. He was known across the land. This was a man who had stood in front of the shogun himself and beaten the founder of one of the most prestigious schools of swordsmanship. Imagine being a child and knowing your dad carried a title that basically meant the best under heaven. Every bruise Musashi earned during practice wasn't just a bruise. It was a reminder that he had to measure up to that. Failure wasn't allowed. Falling short wasn't an option. So Musashi learned to keep going. He learned to swallow pain, to channel his anger, to take each harsh lesson and turn it into fuel. Even when his father's training seemed cruel, even when affection was nowhere to be found, something inside Musashi thrived. He didn't need soft words, he needed a challenge. And challenge was exactly what he got. The stories say he was never the polite child. He wasn't bowing low, reciting neat phrases, or trying to fit into the mold that other kids were squeezed into. He smelled like sweat and dirt. He fought with other children. He didn't mind bruises or cuts. To some adults, he looked like trouble. To others, he looked like a boy who might grow into something terrifying. And they were both right. By the time Musashi was creeping toward his teenage years, you could already sense it. He wasn't ordinary. He had that stare sharp and unblinking. The kind of stare that made grown men shift uncomfortably. He was fearless, maybe too fearless, and fearless people, in a world built on violence, didn't just survive, they rose. And that's the world he grew up in. No softness, no safety net, just a father who treated him like a weapon being forged. A village that watched him like a strange storm brewing in their midst, and a country where warlords turned betrayal into an art form. Musashi was growing into exactly what that world demanded: someone who wouldn't break, someone who wouldn't bend, someone who would take the rules of combat and rip them apart to make his own. He wasn't ready yet, not completely, but the foundation had been laid. The rough boy in the muddy clothes, with dirt under his fingernails and bruises on his arms, was already carrying the weight of destiny. The wildness in him wasn't going away. It was only getting sharper, like the edge of a blade honed over and over again. And soon enough, the world would give him the chance to prove it. His first real duel was waiting just around the corner. At 13 years old, barely more than a child, Musashi would be thrust into the kind of fight that most grown men wouldn't dare face. And the outcome of that fight would mark him forever. 13. Think about that for a second. Most kids at 13 are awkwardly figuring out how to make friends, maybe worrying about school, or trying to survive the horror of their first crush. But in Musashi's world, 13 wasn't a soft landing. It was a cliff's edge. You weren't a child anymore, not really. By that age, you were expected to help work the fields, carry your family's weight, and in Musashi's case, you were already expected to fight. The moment came like a storm rolling into town. A traveling samurai by the name of Arima Kihei arrived in Musashi's village. Now, Ki wasn't just some wandering mercenary. He was trained in the Shinto rite style of fencing, descended from the teachings of the legendary Sukahara Bokuden. That name carried weight. It meant skill, reputation, and an ego to match. Like many wandering warriors, Ki traveled around posting challenges, daring anyone to face him in a public duel. That was how a swordsman made a name for himself back then. You beat others in front of a crowd, and your legend grew. So he came into town, proud and polished, and put up his notice. Anyone who wanted to test their skill could face him. To him, it was routine. Just another chance to show off, to prove himself against some local fighter. Maybe he expected a seasoned man, maybe a student from a nearby dojo. What he did not expect was a 13-year-old boy. Word spread quickly. The villagers whispered, wide-eyed, that Musashi, the wild son of Shimon Musashi, had accepted the challenge. Imagine the scene: farmers leaving their fields, merchants closing up stalls, people streaming toward the dueling ground near the Soho River. They weren't coming to watch a fair fight. They were coming to see a child get crushed. Parents shook their heads, muttering about foolish pride. Even Musashi's uncle, Doran, a local priest who had been caring for him, rushed to Kihei and begged him to back out. "He's just a boy," the uncle pleaded. But honor was everything in that world. Kihei couldn't walk away without losing face, so he agreed. The duel would happen. Picture Musashi in that moment. Barefoot, clothes simple and dirty, his hair unkempt, his face probably still smudged from running wild through the village. In his hands, not even a real sword, just a heavy wooden bokken, a practice weapon. Against him stood Kihei, an adult, a trained samurai, armed with steel. The difference was night and day. Everyone in the crowd thought they knew how this would end, but Musashi didn't care what anyone thought. He wasn't stepping into that fight to bow politely, to follow ceremony, to give his opponent the dignity of tradition. He was stepping into that fight to win, to survive, to prove that all the pain, all the bruises, all the harsh lessons from his father had forged something real. The duel began not with honor, but with chaos. No neat bows, no measured distance. Musashi exploded forward with raw instinct. He charged like an avalanche crashing down a mountainside. Kii, caught off guard, scrambled to draw his sword, expecting the calm rhythm of a formal duel. Instead, he found a boy slamming into him with wild force, swinging that wooden sword like it was an iron hammer. The accounts say Musashi didn't just fight Kihei, he overwhelmed him. He ducked under strikes, knocked him to the ground, and then kept going. Blow after blow, fast, brutal, relentless. The wooden sword cracked against Kihei's head again and again until blood spilled and the man collapsed, vomiting, unable to rise. A grown samurai, skilled in one of the country's proudest schools, defeated and killed by a boy not yet grown. The crowd went silent. Nobody knew what to say. This wasn't how duels were supposed to go. A duel was supposed to be refined, controlled, a display of skill and style. But Musashi had torn the script apart. He hadn't fought like a samurai. He had fought like someone who had no interest in the rules at all. And that, more than his age, more than his strength, terrified everyone watching. For Musashi, this wasn't just about victory. It was a lesson. He realized in that moment that survival didn't belong to the strongest or the most skilled in tradition. It belonged to the one who set the terms of the fight, the one who broke expectations before a single blow was struck. He learned that the mind was the real battlefield, and if he could unsettle his opponent, throw them off balance before the fight even began, then half the battle was already won. Back home, his father's reaction was complicated. Pride, yes, how could Musashi not feel proud that his son had killed a trained man? But there was also a flicker of fear. Even he could see it now. His son was becoming something beyond what he had imagined. A force that couldn't be tamed. A boy stepping out of the shadow of his father and beginning to cast his own. And Musashi himself, he felt clarity. He wasn't meant for farming. He wasn't meant for bowing and scraping to a lord. He was meant to fight, to defeat, to rise. The first blood had been drawn, and deep in his heart, he knew it wouldn't be the last. From that day forward, his name was whispered differently, no longer just that wild boy from Miyamoto. Now, he was something else. A fighter, a killer, a storm beginning to build. People would speak of him with fear, with awe, with curiosity. Because what kind of man could this boy grow into if he was already killing samurai before his voice had even deepened? That duel changed everything. It was the spark that lit the fire of his legend. And Musashi, barely 13, was only just getting started. At 15 years old, most boys in Musashi's world were still finding their place, helping in the fields, apprenticing in trades, or maybe serving in some small capacity for a local lord. But Musashi was never most boys. By that age, he had already killed a grown samurai in a duel. His reputation wasn't just local gossip anymore. It was something whispered with both awe and unease. And so, When the time came to choose a path, Musashi didn't wait for permission. He didn't ask for guidance. He simply left. No tearful farewells, no warm meals packed up for the road. Just a teenage boy, a sword at his side, and a cloak slung across his shoulders. That was it. One day, he walked away from his home in Miyamoto, and he didn't look back. In his mind, there was nothing left to hold him there. His father had forged him like steel, but there were no more lessons to be had under that roof. The village had raised eyebrows, whispered stories, but it couldn't contain him. Musashi knew, deep down, that his destiny wasn't tied to one place or one lord. His path had to be his own. Now, leaving home at 15 wasn't just bold, it was almost unthinkable. In that era, loyalty was the backbone of society. Everyone served someone. Farmers served landowners, craftsmen served guilds, and samurai served their lords. To stand without ties, without allegiance, was to risk being seen as nothing more than a vagabond, a dangerous drifter with no anchor. That's what being a Rao-nin meant, a masterless samurai. It was a title soaked in both pity and suspicion. But Musashi didn't care. To him, freedom was worth more than protection. He wasn't about to polish some lord's armor, or fetch tea for a commander, or bend his knee in endless service. That life might have given him safety, maybe even a stipend or a small house, but it would have caged him. And Musashi didn't want a cage. He wanted the road, the unknown, the endless opportunity to sharpen himself against the world. Life on the road, though, wasn't glamorous. It wasn't some romantic tale of wandering under starlight with endless adventure waiting at every bend. It was rough, dirty, and lonely. Musashi slept under trees or in half-ruined shrines when he could find them. His meals weren't feasts, sometimes a handful of rice if he was lucky, wild plants or river fish if he wasn't. There were nights when hunger gnawed at him so hard it felt like his stomach might eat itself. There were mornings when the frost clung to his clothes, and he woke up shivering, fingers stiff, with only the thought of training to warm him. But to Musashi, every hardship was just another form of practice. Hunger taught him endurance, cold taught him patience, loneliness taught him focus. The wilderness itself became his teacher. Streams, forests, and empty roads hardened him more than any dojo walls could. He learned how to keep walking when his legs ached, how to keep swinging his sword when his arms felt like lead, how to keep his eyes sharp even when exhaustion tried to drag them shut. And then there were the duels, because Musashi didn't just wander for the scenery, he wandered for the fight. In village after village, town after town, he sought out dojos and warriors. He wasn't there to make friends or to join a school. He was there to challenge, to test himself, to prove again and again that his way of fighting, the raw, unpredictable, survival-first style, was sharper than anything tradition could throw at him. The polished samurai, with their neat armor and rehearsed moves, didn't know what to make of him. Here came this scruffy, wild-looking boy with unkempt hair and ragged clothes, calling them out to duel. At first, people laughed. Who was this muddy teenager to challenge trained men? But laughter died quickly when they saw what happened once the blades were drawn. Musashi didn't fight by the book. He didn't wait for formal bows or poetic exchanges. He struck fast, struck hard, and left his opponents broken before they even knew the fight had started. That unpredictability was his weapon. Sometimes he used a wooden sword. Sometimes he used steel. Sometimes, if a weapon wasn't handy, he'd grab a stick from the ground or improvise with whatever he found. To Musashi, the fight wasn't about looking graceful. It was about winning. And the more he fought, the more he realized something important. Every duel wasn't just practice for his sword arm. It was practice for his mind. He began to see patterns in people. The way their eyes gave away fear. The way pride made them predictable. The way hesitation opened them up. To Musashi, the duel became a conversation without words, a game of strategy played at lightning speed. And as he walked from one fight to the next, whispers began to follow him. People started telling stories about the teenage arrow Nin, who defeated seasoned warriors, the boy who seemed more wolf than man. Some told the tales with admiration, others with fear, but all of them added to the growing shadow of his legend. Still, Musashi didn't fight for fame. He didn't stay long enough in one place to bask in glory. He won, nodded once, maybe muttered something curt, and moved on. He wasn't chasing applause, he was chasing mastery, and mastery couldn't be found sitting in one village or serving under one lord. It was out there, on the endless roads, waiting for him to carve it out with every step and every swing of his blade. That's what set him apart. In a culture where loyalty defined a man's worth, Musashi chose something radical. He chose himself. He chose the road. He chose to wander without a master, without ties, without the safety nets that so many others clung to. And while it meant hunger, hardship, and loneliness, it also meant freedom. The kind of freedom that allowed him to fight anyone, learn from anyone, and shape his own path without being chained to tradition. By the time Musashi was still only in his mid-teens, he had already set himself on a course that most men wouldn't dare take even as adults. He wasn't just a boy anymore. He was a Ao Nin, a storm walking across Japan with nothing but a blade and an unshakable will. And with every mile he put behind him, he became less the child of Miyamoto village and more the force of nature history would come to remember. The boy had left home. The road had been born. By now, Musashi had been on the road long enough that people were starting to recognize him. Not everyone had seen him fight with their own eyes, but rumors traveled faster than any horse. Word spread of a wandering Ao Nin, young and fierce, who challenged dojo masters, beat them bloody, and then vanished into the horizon before anyone could ask his name. The image was already growing in people's minds. But here's the thing. Musashi didn't look the part. Not at all. Think of the picture you might have in your head when you hear the word samurai. A tall figure with his hair neatly tied, robes pressed, armor polished until it glinted in the sun. His swords tucked into his belt just so, each one gleaming like it had been cared for by a whole team of attendants. The kind of man who walked into a town and made everyone whisper, "There goes someone important." That was the picture most people expected. Now picture Musashi. His hair was wild, knotted from weeks on the road without oil or comb. His clothes were torn, stained, sometimes half missing after too many fights and too few spare kimonos. His sandals were worn down, his feet calloused and muddy. His smell, let's just say it wasn't the scent of sweet incense or perfumed silk. More like sweat smoke and the dirt of the last roadside ditch he'd slept beside. He looked less like a polished warrior and more like a stray dog that had picked up a pair of swords. And because of that, people laughed. At first, they chuckled when he showed up at a dojo, scruffy and ragged, challenging their best student. Who could take someone like him seriously? He looked more like a woodcutter who had gotten lost than a man fit to duel-trained samurai. But then he moved. And that's when the laughter stopped. Because the moment Musashi picked up a sword, or even just a stick, something changed. All that scruff, all that ragged energy, turned into something terrifyingly efficient. There were no wasted motions, no pretty flourishes. He didn't circle dramatically, didn't bow 6 times before drawing his blade, didn't wait for his opponent to deliver a flowery speech. He struck. Fast. Direct. Brutal. The feral boy from Miyamoto became a predator in human form, every muscle working toward the single goal of ending the fight. That contrast was what unsettled people the most. He looked like a beggar, but fought like a demon. His clothes said, outcast, but his sword said, unstoppable. And soon, that became part of his legend. People stopped describing him only by his victories. They described how he looked while he fought. He doesn't fight like a man, they whispered. Fights like a wild wolf that somehow learned to hold steel. The image of Musashi as this half-wild wanderer spread across provinces. To see him walk into town was to feel unsettled before the fight even began. His appearance worked as its own form of psychological warfare. An opponent would size him up and think, "This ragged man can't possibly beat me." and by the time they realized how wrong they were, Musashi had already closed the distance, already broken through their guard, already left them bleeding and humiliated, and Musashi knew it. He understood that the way he looked made his enemies underestimate him. It threw them off before the duel even began. He didn't polish himself to impress others. He let his roughness become another weapon. Where others wasted time shining their armor and straightening their helmets, Musashi walked straight into the fight, unconcerned with appearances, focused only on victory. The stories grew wilder with every telling. Villagers swore he carried the stink of the wilderness wherever he went. Travelers claimed his stare alone could freeze a man before swords were even drawn. Samurai who had survived encounters with him admitted they had never felt so unprepared. Some even whispered that fighting Musashi wasn't like fighting a man at all. It was like trying to fight a storm, unpredictable and merciless. And still, Musashi didn't care. He wasn't trying to impress them. He wasn't trying to look the part of a noble warrior. In his mind, looking neat and proper didn't win battles. What mattered was the cut, the timing, the strategy. Everything else was decoration. And decoration to Musashi was useless weight. The image of the ragged owl nin became inseparable from the man himself. He was the wolf in rags, the storm in sandals, the swordsman who looked like he'd been dragged through the mud, but who left polished warriors broken in the dirt. And because people could never predict him, because they couldn't reconcile the way he looked with the way he fought, they feared him even more. So by the time Musashi reached his late teens, his reputation wasn't just about the duels he won. It was about how he defied everything a samurai was supposed to be. No master, no polished armor, no fancy rituals, just a boy who looked like trouble and fought like death itself. And the truth was, Musashi liked it that way. The more people underestimated him, the easier it was to break them. The roughness wasn't just who he was, it was part of his strategy. Every scar, every bruise, every ragged edge only added to the fear that spread his name farther and farther down the roads of Japan. Because Musashi wasn't there to look good, he was there to win. By the time Musashi was a few years into his wandering life, the road itself had become part of his identity. He wasn't just drifting aimlessly, every step was sharpening him, every village another test. Every duel another stone grinding the edge of his blade. He wasn't rich, he wasn't clean, and he certainly wasn't comfortable. But he was becoming something more dangerous with each passing mile. Life as a Rao Nin was a strange existence. You were caught between two worlds. To the farmers and townsfolk, you were a threat, armed, ruthless, unpredictable. To the lords and their samurai, you were suspicious. Someone who refused to tie himself down, someone who didn't respect the chain of loyalty, and yet Musashi managed to carve his place in that space. He lived by his own rhythm, and that rhythm usually led to a duel. His strategy was simple: arrive in a new town, find the local dojo, and issue a challenge. Dojo challenges were common at the time. It was a way for schools to prove themselves, to defend their honor, to attract students. But Musashi wasn't doing it for honor or recruitment. He wasn't trying to open a school or collect disciples. He was doing it for one reason only: to grow sharper. Imagine being a young student in one of those dojos. You've been practicing for years, memorizing forms, polishing technique. And then this ragged stranger strolls in, barefoot and unkempt, asking to fight your best. Your teacher agrees, confident that the reputation of the school will be upheld. The crowd gathers. The polished student steps forward, armed and proud, and then Musashi steps into the ring with nothing but a stick or a battered wooden sword. And before anyone has time to blink, your best student is lying flat on the ground, bruised and broken. It kept happening over and over. Musashi walked into polished halls and left chaos in his wake. Dojo masters fumed. Students limped home, and every time, his reputation spread a little farther. He wasn't just a wanderer anymore. He was becoming a storm with a name, and that name was starting to echo across provinces. What made him so hard to fight wasn't just his strength. though he was strong. It wasn't just his speed, though he was quick. It was his unpredictability. Musashi didn't fight like anyone else. He didn't bow the same way. He didn't wait for the signal. He didn't even always use a sword. Sometimes he'd pick up a random staff or a branch. Once, a story goes, he beat a man senseless with a boat oar. Another time, he supposedly used a farmer's tool he found lying around. To Musashi, the weapon was never the point. The mind behind the weapon, that's where the fight was won. He began to study people more than he studied swords. Every twitch of a hand, every shift of a foot, every flicker in someone's eyes told him something. He could read fear like most of us read words on a page. He knew when hesitation would creep in, and he struck the moment it did. He didn't just break bodies, he broke spirits. And that was something no formal dojo could prepare its students for. Soon, people began telling stories of him like he was a ghost drifting from province to province. "He fights like a demon," they said. "He doesn't fight for points, he fights to survive." To see Musashi walk into town was like watching a storm cloud roll in. Some challenged him out of pride, some avoided him out of fear, but all of them added fuel to his legend. And Musashi, he didn't stick around. He didn't bask in applause or gloat over victories. He won, nodded once, maybe muttered something blunt, and moved on. Fame wasn't the prize. The prize was the sharpening of his skill, the deepening of his understanding. With every duel, he was peeling away what didn't work, what was wasteful, what was weak. He was stripping down swordsmanship to its bare essence: speed, timing, strategy, survival. The way he lived made him stand out even more. While other warriors polished their armor and bowed before lords, Musashi slept under trees and let his hair mat into tangles. While others recited poems before battle, Musashi was already swinging. He didn't fit into the tidy world of samurai tradition, and that made him both terrifying and fascinating. He was the living proof that there was another way to be strong, a way outside the system, outside the codes, outside the expectations. By the time he reached his late teens, Musashi's win column was absurd. More victories than birthdays. More bruised opponents than most men saw in a lifetime. His name was spreading far beyond the dusty roads he walked. Lords heard of him. Samurai whispered about him. Some tried to recruit him, offering gold, land, fine clothes, even marriage alliances. But Musashi refused them all. He didn't want to be tied down. He didn't want safety or luxury. Castles to him were just cages lined with silk, and so he kept walking, kept fighting, kept learning. Somewhere inside, Musashi was beginning to realize something deeper, that every duel was more than a test of skill. It was a test of the mind. He was learning that a fight was often over before the first strike landed, won in the space of doubt inside his opponent's heart. He began to see life itself as strategy, rhythm, timing, initiative. Everything was a battle of perception, and that realization pushed him toward something greater than just winning duels. It pushed him toward inventing his own way. He was already questioning tradition, already bending rules, already seeing himself not as a student of any one school, but as the founder of a path that didn't exist yet. For now, though, the road stretched on. Villages, dojos, challenges. A trail of bruised egos and broken warriors left behind him. People told stories in tea houses, around fires, in whispers. There's a wild Rao nin out there. He looks like a beggar, but fights like a demon. If you see him, best step aside. And Musashi, he just kept walking. Because for him, there was no final victory yet. Only the next duel, the next lesson, the next chance to carve his path a little sharper. The boy from Miyamoto was gone. In his place now stood a young man whose legend was growing like thunder on the horizon, and the world was about to find out just how dangerous that storm could become. By the time Musashi drifted into Kyoto, he wasn't just another nameless Ao Nin anymore. His reputation had started to stretch far enough that whispers of him reached even the capital. Kyoto wasn't some dusty roadside village. It was the heart of Japan's culture, the old imperial city, a place where traditions weighed heavy and names carried power. To walk into Kyoto as a wandering outsider was bold enough. But Musashi wasn't there just to pass through. He had his eyes set on something bigger, something dangerous. And that something was the Yoshioka school. Now, let's talk about the Yoshioka for a moment. They weren't just a dojo with a few students sparring in the yard. They were the elite. For generations, they had been the official sword instructors to the Ashikaga shogunate. Their school, the Yoshioka Rate, was one of the most prestigious in the capital, a cornerstone of samurai tradition. These were men of wealth, status, and skill. Their very name was tied to authority. And here comes Musashi, this scruffy nin who looked like he hadn't bathed in a week, deciding he was going to take them on. But it wasn't just random. Musashi had history with the Yoshioka, even if it wasn't his personal history. His father, Muni Sai, had once dueled their founder Yoshioka Kenpo in front of the shogun himself, and Muni Sai had won. That wound had never fully healed. So when Musashi issued his challenge, it wasn't just some nameless drifter trying to make a name for himself. It was the son of the man who had humiliated their founder, reopening an old scar in front of the entire city. The first fight was against Yoshioka Seijuro, the current head of the school. Seijuro was no amateur. He was respected, skilled, a man of status. And when Musashi challenged him, everyone expected the outcome to be swift and humiliating. For Musashi, who could take this vagabond seriously against the head of one of Kyoto's most powerful sword schools? But Musashi didn't play by the rules. He never did. On the day of the duel, he used one of his favorite tricks. He arrived late. This wasn't laziness. It was strategy. By keeping Seijuro waiting, he forced the man into a state of irritation and impatience. By the time Musashi finally sauntered in, Seijuro was already off balance. Not with his body, but with his mind. The fight itself, brutal and simple. The weapons were wooden swords bokken. The rules first clean blow wins. But Musashi didn't treat it like a polite exchange. He moved like a storm, fast and direct, striking Seijuro's shoulder with such force that it shattered his arm. In front of witnesses, the proud master of the Yoshioka school was broken by this wild nin. The humiliation was unbearable. Seijuro retired from the warrior's life entirely, shaving his head and retreating into monkhood. That might have been enough for most men, but not for the Yoshioka. Their pride had been slashed open, and pride doesn't bleed quietly. Seijuro's younger brother, Denshichiro, stepped forward to restore the family honor. He challenged Musashi to another duel, this time to the death. The stage was set at the Sanjusan Jendo Temple, famous for its 1,000 statues of the goddess of mercy. Fitting, because mercy was the last thing anyone expected from this fight. Denshichiro was larger, stronger, more aggressive than his brother. He came armed with a massive weapon and burning rage. The crowd gathered, buzzing with anticipation. Surely this time, the Yoshioka would restore their name. Surely this time, the scruffy nin would meet his end. Once again, Musashi showed up late. Once again, he twisted the rhythm of the duel before it even began. Denshichiro, furious and impatient, launched in with heavy strikes. But Musashi was calm, reading every move, and when the moment came, he delivered one clean, devastating blow to Denshichiro's head with his wooden sword. Just like that, the younger brother was dead. Kyoto gasped. Two brothers of the most prestigious school in the city, both fallen to the same man. At this point, the Yoshioka's honor wasn't just wounded. It was in pieces. Their prestige, their name, their entire legacy teetered on the edge of collapse. And instead of bowing to defeat, they made one final, desperate move. They declared another duel. This time the challenger was Mutashichiro, the new head of the family. There was just one problem. Mutashichiro was only 12 years old, a child. On paper, it sounded absurd, a duel between Musashi and a boy, but everyone knew what it really was. It was a trap. The Yoshioka had no intention of playing fair anymore. They gathered dozens of their men, swordsmen, archers, even men armed with muskets, and set them in hiding around the duel site, a pine grove near Hachidai Shrine. The plan was simple: lure Musashi into a fight with the boy, then ambush him and kill him under a rain of steel and arrows. But here's where Musashi's cunning outshone them all. He knew, he sensed the trap, and instead of walking blindly into it, he broke his own pattern. Instead of arriving late, he arrived early. Hours before the duel was supposed to start, Musashi slipped into the shadows of the grove and waited. From his hiding spot, he watched as the Yoshioka assembled their ambush. He saw the boy arrive in full armor, acting as bait. He saw the warriors creeping into position, blades ready, bows drawn. And then, at the perfect moment, Musashi struck. He surged out of the shadows like a ghost, cutting down Matashiro before the boy even understood what was happening. The Yoshioka fighters roared and swarmed, swords flashing, arrows loosed. But Musashi didn't panic. For the first time, he drew both of his swords, the katana in one hand, the wakizashi in the other. And with that, he carved his way through the ambush, moving like a whirlwind of steel. Witnesses later said it was like watching a man fight with four arms. Musashi slashed, deflected, cut, and dodged, slipping through the trap as though he had written it himself. By the time the chaos ended, he had vanished into the mist, leaving bodies and broken pride behind him. The Yoshioka school, once the pride of Kyoto, was shattered. They never recovered. And Musashi? He didn't stay to gloat. He didn't stand on the ruins of their honor and shout his name. He simply walked away. Because for him, victory was never about pride. It was about learning, about testing, about sharpening himself against the hardest stone he could find. And in Kyoto, he had found it and broken it. The Yoshioka vendetta wasn't just another duel. It was the moment Musashi went from being a wandering Aonin with a growing reputation to a true legend. It was proof that he could not only defeat individuals, but dismantle an entire school, one that had stood at the top of the samurai world for generations. And in the midst of it all, something new had been born, the two-sword style. What started as a desperate adaptation in the chaos of an ambush was now a seed that would grow into Musashi's greatest innovation. Two swords, one warrior, a style unlike anything Japan had seen before. Kyoto had tried to swallow him. Instead, Musashi walked away sharper, deadlier, and more determined than ever. And the road ahead was still long. After Kyoto, after the dust settled and the Yoshioka name lay in ruins, Musashi didn't just walk away with victories. He walked away with something far more valuable: clarity. The ambush at Hachidai Shrine had forced him to fight differently. In that grove, surrounded by dozens of swords and arrows, he had reached for both blades at once, the long katana and the short wakizashi, and moved with them together as if he had been born to fight that way. That night, Musashi didn't just survive. He discovered the seed of something new. Up until then, tradition had been everything in Japanese swordsmanship. Every school taught its patterns. Every style had its rituals. For centuries, samurai had been trained to use the katana with two hands, drawing every ounce of strength and precision from that grip. It was clean. It was elegant. It was tradition. And Musashi had never been one for tradition. He saw flaws in it. A two-handed grip meant power, yes, but it also meant limitation. It was rigid. If you were fighting one opponent in a neat, ceremonial duel, it worked fine. But life wasn't always neat. Enemies didn't always come one at a time. Ambushes didn't wait for bows and rituals. And on horseback, or in cramped alleys, or in the chaos of a battlefield, that rigid grip left gaps. Musashi had felt those gaps firsthand, and he wasn't about to ignore them, so he started training, relentlessly. Day after day, he pushed himself to master two blades at once, the katana in his right hand, the wakizashi in his left. At first, it was chaos. Imagine trying to write with both hands at the same time. He dropped blades. He tripped over his own feet. He nearly sliced himself more than once. It was messy, awkward, even embarrassing. But Musashi was nothing if not stubborn. Slowly, painfully, something clicked. The rhythm began to emerge. The long blade slashed. The short blade blocked. One hand deflected while the other struck. Left, right, left, like a heartbeat of steel. It wasn't just fighting. It was a dance. A deadly, efficient dance. And once he felt that rhythm, He knew he had stumbled onto something no other school had truly embraced. The beauty of it was in its adaptability. 2 blades gave him options. It let him control distance and tempo. With the short sword, he could smother his opponent's weapon, redirecting attacks, stealing away their rhythm. With the long sword, he could strike decisively, cutting through hesitation in a flash. Together, they gave him control over the fight in a way no single blade could. The first time he started using it in real duels, opponents didn't know what to do. They were trained to expect a single sword. Their defenses, their stances, their very mindset, everything assumed one blade. Suddenly they were facing 2, each moving with equal purpose. 1 strike became 2, 1 defense became 3. They blocked 1 attack only to be caught by another from a different angle. Confusion set in, panic followed, and Musashi thrived on both. Of course, the traditionalists scoffed. Samurai in their polished castles muttered into their sake cups, calling it dishonorable, clumsy, a break from centuries of refined technique. But Musashi didn't care. To him, the sword wasn't about elegance. It wasn't about looking graceful or pleasing a lord. It was about survival, about victory, about finding the strategy that worked when everything else fell apart. And that's what he began to call it, strategy. Hi-ho no mishi, the way of strategy. It wasn't just about swinging faster or hitting harder. It was about adaptability, about controlling the flow of a fight before it even began, about making your opponent dance to your rhythm while you cut them down at your own pace. The 2-sword style wasn't just a technique, it was philosophy. It was Musashi's rejection of rigidity, his refusal to bow to tradition for tradition's sake. He looked at the polished moves of the great schools and saw wasted motion, empty flourishes, arrogance dressed as art, and he stripped it all away. What remained was pure, functional, terrifyingly effective. He named his school Heion Nighton Ichirit, which translates to the school of the strategy of 2 heavens as one. 2 swords, 2 heavens, united in one purpose. It was revolutionary. No longer did a samurai have to choose between katana and wakizashi. In Musashi's hands, they were partners, halves of the same spirit, flowing together like twin rivers meeting at the sea. Imagine the reaction in those days. Samurai who had trained their whole lives in single sword technique, suddenly confronted by this wild nin wielding 2 blades with a rhythm no one could follow. Dojo scrambled to prepare their students for it. But how do you prepare for something you don't understand? Musashi had rewritten the rules, and everyone else was still trying to read the old book. It's hard to overstate how radical it was. For centuries, mastery had meant fitting into the pattern, repeating the forms, bowing to the wisdom of those who came before. Musashi broke all of that. He said, in effect, why repeat the past when you can carve a new future? He didn't just use the sword as a weapon. He used it as a statement that adaptability mattered more than ancestry, that victory mattered more than appearances, that strategy mattered more than ceremony. And so, wherever he wandered, the whispers grew. He fights with 2 swords. The words alone carried fear. Because if Musashi didn't fight like anyone else, how could anyone prepare for him? He had stepped outside tradition, and in doing so, he made himself untouchable. This wasn't just the next step in his journey. It was the turning point where Musashi stopped being a Rao-nin who challenged schools, and became a school unto himself. Every duel from here on out was not just a fight. It was a demonstration of his new way, his living proof that 2 heavens could become one. And yet, even with this innovation, Musashi wasn't satisfied. He wasn't just chasing victories, he was chasing perfection. Every duel was another lesson, every challenge another step on the endless road of mastery. He knew the path wasn't finished. It might never be finished, but now, he wasn't just walking the road, he was paving it. By the time Musashi entered his 20s, he wasn't just another masterless swordsman trudging down country roads. He had become something far stranger, far more unsettling. His name was spreading like a rumor carried on the wind, part fact, part myth, all wrapped in that aura of danger. You didn't just hear about Musashi in tea houses and inns. You heard him whispered about in castles, in dojos, in villages miles apart. He had become a storm people couldn't stop talking about. Everywhere he went, the pattern repeated itself. He'd arrive in some new town, his clothes ragged, his hair unkempt, and the smell of the road clinging to him. At first, people would laugh. Who was this scruffy wanderer? He looked more like a bandit than a warrior. But then he'd issue his challenge. Then the dojo masters would step up, or some proud samurai eager to defend his honor. And then, once again, Musashi would fight, and the laughter would vanish. Victory followed him like a shadow. Time after time, duel after duel, he cut down opponents who were supposed to be untouchable. Skilled students, respected teachers, even whole schools like the Yoshioka. No one seemed able to stop him. And what made it worse, at least for his enemies, was the way he fought. There was nothing elegant, nothing ornamental about it. Musashi fought with efficiency so raw it looked almost ugly. No wasted motion, no polite pauses, no ceremony. He just broke people down, physically and mentally, until they crumbled. And that unpredictability, the fact that no one could read him, was its own kind of legend. Stories started growing taller with every telling. Some said he could see into a man's soul. Others claimed he fought like he had 4 arms, his 2-sword style moving too fast for the eye to follow. A few swore he could beat a dozen men alone, slipping through them like mist while his blades flashed in every direction. People weren't just afraid of Musashi's strength. They were afraid of what he represented, the idea that tradition itself could be shattered by one stubborn, wild man who refused to play by the rules. And here's the thing, Musashi didn't slow down to savor it. He didn't sit in one town, enjoying fame or glory. He kept moving, like a storm cloud drifting over the land. The more his name spread, the less you saw him in one place. He was always somewhere else, already onto the next challenge, the next test, the next chance to sharpen himself. Fame never seemed to interest him. In fact, it might have annoyed him. He wasn't fighting for applause. He was fighting for something bigger, something only he seemed to understand. Of course, that reputation cut both ways. On one hand, it brought challengers from all corners of the land. Samurai who wanted to test themselves, schools who wanted to prove they could beat him, lords who wanted to recruit him. Everyone wanted a piece of Musashi. On the other hand, it also brought fear. Some warriors avoided him altogether, refusing to meet his gaze, changing roads if they heard he was nearby. Because facing Musashi wasn't just a fight, it was a gamble with your reputation, your life, and your pride. Lose to him, and the whole country would hear about it. Offers came too. Musashi's victories made him valuable. Lords reached out, offering gold, land, fine clothes, even wives if he would pledge his service. For a man who had once slept under trees and gone hungry for days, those offers could have been tempting, but Musashi refused them all. He didn't want to wear a lord's crest, didn't want to live behind castle walls. Castles to him were cages, no matter how pretty. He would rather walk the dusty road in rags, free to fight and learn on his own terms, than serve in silk. That decision only made his reputation grow. People couldn't pin him down. Was he a demon, a saint, a madman, a genius? Every answer seemed possible, depending on who you asked. To some, he was proof of the samurai spirit at its fiercest. To others, he was a warning that loyalty and tradition could be crushed by a single man too wild to be chained. And Musashi leaned into that mystery. He didn't explain himself. He didn't tell people why he wandered, why he fought, why he refused to settle down. He just kept going. Every duel added another layer to his myth, until it was hard to tell where the real Musashi ended and the legend began. Was he undefeated? Almost. Did he really fight whole gangs of swordsmen alone? Possibly. Did he carve wooden swords from boat oars and win duels with them? Absolutely. And each time a new story spread, people didn't question it. They just added it to the growing storm cloud that was his name. By now, Musashi wasn't just a man, he was a presence. His reputation arrived in a town before he did. His shadow stretched across Japan, making warriors restless and lords curious. And even as he wandered alone, hungry, ragged, and often sleeping under the open sky, he carried himself like someone who had already stepped outside the reach of ordinary men. The wanderer had become something more. Not a master with students, not a lord with servants, not a bandit with followers. Just Musashi, the storm, the wolf, the swordsman no one could ignore. And the road ahead was only leading him toward even greater challenges. Because if Japan already whispered his name now, what would they say after he faced the greatest duel of his life? By the time whispers of Sasaki Kojie reached Musashi's ears, he had already cut a trail of victories across Japan. But every legend needs a rival. And Kojie wasn't just another swordsman. He was the perfect opposite. The mirror image Musashi didn't even know he'd been walking toward. At first, it was just rumors. People in inns and roadside towns spoke of a man with a blade so long it looked like it could brush the sky. They called him the demon of the western provinces. He was undefeated, sharp as lightning, graceful as a swallow darting through the air. His sword, a massive nodachi, so long they nicknamed it the drying pole, like the bamboo rods used to hang clothes. His technique, the Tsubame gashi, or swallow cut. A slash so quick, so precise, it was said to be impossible to block. Where Musashi was rough and wild, Kojie was polished and elegant. Musashi wore ragged robes and let his hair tangle. Kojie dressed in flowing silks, his movements theatrical, almost like a kabuki actor on stage. Musashi fought with ugly efficiency, breaking rules and fighting dirty. Kojie treated the sword like art, every move beautiful, every cut precise. If Musashi was the storm, Kojie was the lightning bolt. Sharp, direct, dazzling. It was inevitable they would meet. Two undefeated men, two opposing philosophies. The country buzzed with the idea of their clash, as if destiny itself had been waiting for this moment. And eventually, the challenge was set. The place Ganri-jima, a tiny island in the Kanman Straits. The date April 13, 1612. The sponsor Lord Hosokawa Tadaoki, who arranged the duel to settle the question of who was truly the greatest swordsman of their age. For Musashi, it wasn't just another duel. It was the duel, the one that would define him forever. Now, here's where Musashi's genius really shone. He didn't just fight with swords. He fought with the mind, with psychology. And for Kojie, who thrived on polish and precision, Musashi decided to shatter that polish before the blades even crossed. On the morning of the duel, while Kojie prepared himself with careful ritual, Musashi overslept. Or at least, that's what people said. Maybe it was genuine. Maybe it was deliberate. Either way, when the boatman came to fetch him, Musashi was still in bed. He rose slowly, washed himself in the ocean, and boarded the boat with no hurry in his step. On the way across, he did something unusual. He carved a wooden sword from a spare boat oar, longer than Kojie's famous drying pole, rough, unpolished, but deadly in his hands. By the time Musashi's boat scraped onto the sand of Ganri-jima, Kojie was already there, tall, lean, dressed immaculately, his massive sword gleaming in the sun. Around them stood officials, retainers, and witnesses, waiting with bated breath. They had already been waiting for hours. Kojie's jaw was tight, his eyes burning with fury at Musashi's lateness. And that, right there, was Musashi's first victory. When the duel began, Kojie threw away his scabbard, a symbolic gesture meaning he would fight to the death. Musashi smiled faintly and said, "If you have no more use for your sheath, then you are already dead." With those words, the air between them cracked with tension. Kojie struck first, unleashing his famous swallow cut. The blade came down in a blur, faster than most eyes could follow. But Musashi had been waiting for it. He stepped just outside the arc, timing his movement perfectly, and with a single, crushing strike from his carved wooden sword, he brought it down on Kojie's head. The sound was sharp, final. Kojie collapsed onto the sand, motionless. In that instant, the island fell silent. The demon of the western provinces, the undefeated master, lay broken by a ragged Ao Nin wielding a stick. Musashi lowered his weapon, calm, breathing steady, his eyes as unreadable as ever. He bowed to his fallen rival, showing respect even in victory. Because Musashi knew this had not been just another fight, it had been a clash of worlds. The witnesses spread the story like wildfire. Some said Musashi had tricked Kojiro. Others said he had simply been the sharper strategist. Either way, the duel became legend. Not just because of the victory, but because of what it meant. Kojiro was perfection within tradition, the peak of elegance. Musashi was strategy, adaptability, raw instinct. And in the end, strategy beat perfection. For Musashi, the duel was bittersweet. He had reached the top of the mountain, defeated the opponent who could truly test him. But with that victory came a strange emptiness. Because once you've beaten the best, what's left? The road stretched on, but now it was quieter, lonelier. He had proven himself to the world, but proving something to yourself is a harder, longer battle. Still, the duel on Ganri-jima sealed his name forever. From then on, Musashi wasn't just a famous swordsman, he was the greatest. The man who had faced the most feared warrior in Japan and won with nothing but a carved oar, a sharp mind, and the will to bend the rules. That day on the island wasn't just the end of Kojiro. It was the beginning of Musashi the legend. And yet, even with the world calling his name, Musashi didn't stop. Because victory, to him, was never the end. It was just another step towards something greater. After Ganri-jima, after that single, perfect strike on Sasaki Kojiro, Musashi stood at the peak of his reputation. There was no question anymore. He was the greatest swordsman alive. The undefeated Ronin, the storm that tore through dojos and masters alike. The man who had beaten the demon of the western provinces with nothing but a carved oar. His name echoed across Japan. And yet, instead of basking in glory, Musashi did something unexpected. He began to turn inward. It makes sense if you think about it. For years, maybe decades, his entire life had been one long duel. Every day was practice, every village another test, every opponent another stepping stone. But once you've reached the top of the mountain, once you've beaten the best, what's left? For Musashi, the answer wasn't just more fighting. It was finding meaning beyond the blade. He didn't stop dueling altogether. He still fought when challenged, still honed his skill. But his focus began to widen. He started to see connections between swordsmanship and other arts. Calligraphy, painting, carpentry, even the tea ceremony. To Musashi, these weren't separate worlds. They were all part of the same path. The same discipline, the same need for rhythm, patience, and awareness. Holding a brush wasn't so different from holding a sword. Carving wood wasn't so different from carving through an opponent's defense. Everything, he realized, was strategy. This shift was striking to people who only knew him as a feral duelist. Imagine hearing stories of Musashi sleeping under trees, ragged and unkempt, and then walking into a small shrine to see him quietly painting, his strokes calm and deliberate. His calligraphy was bold, his ink painting stark but alive. Even today, centuries later, some of those works survive, brushstrokes that carry the same sharpness and confidence as his sword. He also studied Zen, embracing its quiet, reflective side. Meditation, emptiness, the stillness in the middle of chaos. These ideas resonated with him. Perhaps because he had lived so long in the chaos of battle, he was drawn to the calm that balanced it. The Musashi who once charged headlong into duels was learning to sit still, to breathe, to think. And yet, even in these softer pursuits, the warrior in him never disappeared. His paintings often depicted fierce animals, hawks, dragons, wild creatures full of power. His calligraphy carried the same intensity as a strike. His carpentry wasn't decorative but practical, sharp, built to last. Whatever he touched, it carried his spirit simple, direct, no wasted motion. People began to see another side of him. Not just Musashi the killer, but Musashi the thinker, Musashi the artist, Musashi the philosopher. He started to teach students not just how to wield two swords, but how to approach life as a whole. His lessons weren't about memorizing forms or copying rituals. They were about adaptability, awareness, and strategy. about finding the rhythm in everything. Combat, art, even conversation. It's easy to picture him in those years older now, a little more weathered, sitting cross-legged with a brush in hand, pausing to explain to a young student that the stroke of ink on paper is no different from the cut of a sword. Both require timing, both require presence, both demand total attention. What makes this part of his life so fascinating is the balance. Musashi didn't abandon the warrior's path, he expanded it. He proved that mastery wasn't about fighting endlessly. It was about understanding, about seeing the world itself as a duel, every moment a chance to adjust, adapt, and create. And for someone who had spent so much of his life breaking rules, this was the ultimate lesson that the way of the sword was never really about killing. It was about living with clarity, about stripping away the unnecessary until only truth remained. So the man who once terrified dojos and humiliated proud samurai was now painting hawks, writing about strategy, and meditating in quiet rooms. But don't mistake that for softness. Musashi's art was as sharp as his sword. His philosophy was forged from the same steel. The boy who had been raised as a weapon had become something far greater, a warrior who understood that true mastery wasn't about endless bloodshed, but about seeing the unity between all things. And in the quiet of those years, the seed of his greatest work began to form, the book that would carry his voice through the centuries, the Book of Five Rings. By the time Musashi was old, the road had worn deep into him. The storm that once tore through villages and dojos was quieter now, but no less powerful. His hair had gone grey, his body bore the scars of countless battles, and his hands, once calloused from endless duels, were steadier now with a brush than with a blade. But the fire inside him hadn't dimmed. It had simply shifted, turning from the urgency of youth into the clarity of wisdom. He had spent decades walking the path of the sword. From the boy who killed a grown man at 13, to the Aro nin who wandered hungry and ragged, to the storm that dismantled the Yoshioka school, to the duelist who stood victorious on the sands of Ganri-jima. His life had been one long battle, but now, as the years wound down, Musashi began to reflect on what it all meant. He understood something that most warriors never realized: the sword itself had never been the point. Victory was never the true goal. What mattered was the mind, the strategy, the awareness. All those duels, all those nights on the road, all those bruises and scars, they were just the training ground for something larger. And he knew it was time to pass that larger truth on. In his later years, Musashi withdrew from the bustle of towns and cities. He chose to live in quiet places, spending more time painting, carving, teaching, and writing. But most famously, he retreated into a cave called Rygand. It was there, sitting in the dim light of the stone walls, that he began to write his greatest work, Go-Rin no Shu, the Book of Five Rings. Think about that for a moment. The same man who once slept under trees, unwashed and half-starved, was now sitting in silence, turning his life into words, not poetry, not romantic tales, but strategy, pure, distilled wisdom born from a lifetime of fighting and watching and learning. He broke it into 5 parts, each named after an element: earth, water, fire, wind, and void. Earth was the foundation, the grounding of the warrior. Water was adaptability, flowing to fit every situation. Fire was the intensity of battle, the chaos of combat. Wind was the study of other schools, their styles, their flaws. And void, perhaps the most mysterious, was about nothingness, the clarity that comes when you strip away all illusions and see truth directly. But here's the thing. The Book of Five Rings wasn't really just about swordsmanship. Yes, it described dueling, footwork, timing, and technique. But beneath all of that was a philosophy that could apply to anything: leadership, art, life itself. It was about rhythm, awareness, and adaptability. About seeing the world clearly and moving with it instead of against it. About never being trapped by rigid forms, but always ready to change, to adjust, to strike at the right moment. Those lessons weren't meant for just warriors. They were for anyone willing to walk the path of discipline and clarity. And that's why the book survives today. not just in Japan, but across the world. It's read by martial artists, soldiers, business leaders, and everyday people looking for wisdom. Musashi's voice still echoes, not because he killed so many men, but because he saw through fighting into something deeper. As he wrote, you can imagine him pausing, brush hovering above the paper, thinking back over his life. The boyhood under a strict father. The blood on the ground when he was only 13. The long, lonely road as a Rao-nin. The humiliation he dealt to proud schools. The duel on the island against Kojir. The paintings, the carpentry, the quiet moments with students. All of it condensed into one final offering to the world. When Musashi finally passed away in 1645, he did so not as a vagabond or a duelist, but as a master who had left behind more than victories. He left behind a path, a way of thinking, a philosophy that still guides people centuries later. He died undefeated, but more importantly, he died understood by himself, if not by everyone else. And maybe that's the real lesson of Musashi's life. That mastery isn't about looking perfect or following rules or chasing applause. It's about stripping away everything unnecessary until only truth remains. For Musashi, that truth was strategy, the way of the sword. For us, it might be something else. But the lesson is the same: clarity, adaptability, presence. That's what carries you through battles, whether they're fought with steel or with everyday struggles. So when we talk about Musashi today, when we remember the undefeated Rao-nin, we're not just remembering a man who swung two swords. We're remembering someone who turned a life of violence into a philosophy of balance. Someone who proved that even in the harshest world, you can carve your own path, if you're willing to break free from the rules and walk it with relentless focus. From the muddy boy in Miyamoto village to the legend who left his words in a cave, Musashi's life was a journey of transformation. And as you settle in tonight, maybe that's the story to carry with you. Not just the battles, not just the blood, but the way he turned struggle into wisdom, chaos into clarity. Because in the end, Miyamoto Musashi's greatest victory wasn't over an opponent. It was over himself.